Welcome to Briefly Speaking. I'm Dr. Sonia Laurel.
And I'm Dr. Katie Atkins, and we are the co-founders of Blooming Life Institute, where we provide education and foster connection to help people live life in full bloom.
Loss is such a big part of life, and it can be really difficult to talk about. And sometimes we don't even realize the impact that it has on us.
So this is a space for conversation to bring stories of grief and loss to light.
So what we wanted to do today is to get started, is to talk about the model of grief that we've developed called the Transcending loss model. And it has several spaces to it. And we wanted to tell you a little bit about why we developed this model and how it came to be, and give you a little bit of overview of what it consists of.
So historically speaking, there's been task models and stage models, even process models. And what we wanted to bring to you is a model that really resonated with who we are as counselors and as people who have lived in and through and with grief on a daily basis from a developmental perspective, and also weaving in the wellness model, because that's truly how we go about living our life.
And a lot of this is very personal work. Like, we are counselor educators and we work with students and helping them to be prepared to work with clients who are experiencing grief. So that's part of why we wanted to do this. But a lot of what this came out was from our own experiences. We've experienced loss, and we looked to those models, and it felt like too pathologizing. It felt like too much of an equation or too much of a task, and it didn't kind of took the humanness out of it.
Yeah, almost prescriptive, right? Like, if I've experienced this for X number of days, I should feel a certain way. And when in spaces where we felt comfortable enough sharing our loss together, this model grew out of being brave and sharing that we didn't fit into a particular phase or task or stage, and rather we're still learning how to be in the world as we are and be true to ourselves while honoring the grief that we carry with us on a daily basis.
Yeah. And so we wanted to find a more hopeful and accurate and authentic description of what I think is just part of the normal human existence and experience.
Right, because grief is part of our lives. Everyone will experience grief, and we need to figure out a way to acknowledge grief in our daily lives, right? And so grief happens to all of us. Grief is a natural response to loss, and we really need to figure out a way to help educate people, not just clients, but people in the world around us, around what grief is like, what is normative, what's not normative, how do you make sense of that, but also with a positive trajectory so that we're not pathologizing the grief process, because grief in itself is not a diagnosis.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that we really wanted to do is expand, as you're saying, like, understand loss. We want to expand the idea of loss and grief beyond death. And this just happened to us yesterday. We're on the way to a conference, and we're writing in a chapter about this model. And at the very end of the flight, there was a passenger next to us and said, "Oh, I see you're writing about death." And that's not accurate. We're not writing about death. We're writing about loss. And there's so many ways loss impacts us. And I think while death can be one of them, I think we need to expand and recognize how losses are impacting us beyond just death.
Oh, absolutely. So as we start to conceptualize our lives, right, from a developmental perspective and through the lifespan, we're also considering, where are those moments in time, those points in time where we've experienced significant loss. And yes, some of those things can be death-related losses, but so much is actually non-death related. When we move, when we have to switch schools, when we lose a partner or a friendship, when we have to change jobs, and even so much loss experienced through the pandemic. So we can kind of see how loss has to be integrated throughout the lifespan in ways that we carry with us in terms of like building our identity along the way. So grief is not necessarily something that we work through, that we work around. It's something that we learn and grow with. And so how do we become new versions of ourselves while still honoring the loss? And so we're trying to figure out ways, or we've been talking about ways in which to incorporate those losses along the way, with a positive healing trajectory where you can hold space for the both and. So yes, I've had experienced a lot of loss, and I'm still here, and I can feel hope and joy and love in my daily life.
Which is why we chose the word transcending. It's because transcending is never a place that you arrive. It's not a final destination. It's not like I've
Gotten over it.
I'm healed.
Yeah.
I'm over it. I've accepted
Mhm.
it. I've arrived. Rather that it's something that we develop as a process that continues to happen and continues throughout our lifespan. And so it becomes more about integrating the loss rather, and transcending into a new version of ourselves rather than something that we let go of or like get over.
Yeah, truly a way to carry it with us while not impacting, not impeding our daily life. It does impact us, but it doesn't impede the daily life. You can find space to honor loved ones lost or experiences lost along the way, while also still looking forward to what's to come. So a celebration of amidst all of the loss that you've experienced throughout the lifetime.
But I wanted to also add that a part of our process with this wasn't just to look at our own experiences, but to interview other people and listen to their stories of loss. And in future episodes, you will hear about those and you'll hear how they're connected to this model. That's where the richness is that we learn from each other, that we learn from each other's stories. And that's what we really want this space to be, is a place for everyone to learn from stories of loss, so that it's not about finding one path towards that transcendence and transcending process. It's about finding your own unique path in that. And so we wanted to like really listen closely to other people's experiences. And so that's part of how we've developed this model as well.
So in this season of Griefly Speaking, you're going to hear from a multitude of people, and we're going to walk you through our model to show very specific examples of how various people from different phases and stages of life fit into the model in terms of how they are working through their own grief process. So it'll be a way for us to share out our model, as well as to show how people can fall into these spaces throughout time and where they are currently.
For me, I really like the idea of we're on this journey of life. And if we're on a path, there's things that make a path challenging. And so there's different navigations and places and terrain that can make a space difficult to maneuver or easier to maneuver. So that's how we're, again, it takes it away from this task or stage that we have to check off and just like do this thing and then we'll be healed, rather than we're navigating a space on a path through life. And so it kind of normalizes in a way. And so the first space is really our uncharted territory. And in this space, it's really like an untested space. Loss hasn't happened. And so there can be a naive quality to there, where we all know to some degree that loss happens. Like I know for sure that people die when early in my life, but if I haven't experienced that, I don't know how bad it can feel. I don't know the pain that it like truly personally. So that's how it's uncharted. And we can know that cognitively that this happens to others and that loss exists, but like our visceral experience of it doesn't really exist in a way where it becomes a space. And so in my mind, as I've experienced this, it's kind of like a coasting feeling. Like I can see the road ahead. I can drive easily, I can walk easily, I can tell where I'm going. But there can also be like this vulnerability to the space, because I know it can happen. Like at any point, I'm not completely protected from loss. And so even though I don't know the pain, I know that pain can be coming.
Right. I may have seen it through other people. This has happened to others, but it hasn't happened to me. And so I've seen the way that loss impacts people, but I haven't quite experienced it myself. So the unchartedness is also the naivete that comes with not knowing exactly how those feelings would resonate with my personal self.
Yeah. And some losses we don't know is coming. If we know that everybody dies, but we don't know that about some of the diagnoses and illnesses and health problems that can happen. We don't expect like job losses. We don't expect relationships to end necessarily, even though we, can have a cognitive idea of it. So some of the losses really truly are in out of our view completely. So
and then there's even some that are probably somewhere in the middle, right? So I'm thinking of my military families that I've worked with and seen and lived among at certain points in time. And even though they know that their lifestyle is transient, it still doesn't seem to help them cope with some of the loss. It's kind of like this ebb and flow through. I make connections and I leave connections, and I have to be okay with that. But yet true integration of how the loss is impacting them along the way isn't really talked about, isn't really sorted through or unpacked.
the next space is really a shorter period of time, usually is that initial reaction to the loss. So something happens, and whether it's a loss of a pet, a loss of a loved one, a loss of a job, an end of a relationship, while I think we want to leave some space for this, can look very different for different people depending on the type of loss and what their previous losses were. A lot of times though, this is like a time of intense emotions, like the shock, like I didn't expect this. If you weren't expecting it, it could be sadness, fear, confusion, and a sense of like things aren't the same anymore.
Yeah, almost as if the grief response is overwhelming the system in all ways, right? So physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and that can look very different for everyone, right? Some of us might tend to be more numb, some of us might emote in those spaces and time, whereas others might just kind of dig in and keep working so that other people feel taken care of when we put ourselves on the back burner.
Yeah, so there's nothing about this space that we want to say like X, Y, and Z is what the only way to feel. And if you don't feel, there's something wrong with you. Anything is possible in this initial reaction. And there's a lot of factors that can impact how this initial response looks and feels for a person, depending on cultural messages, previous experiences, was it anticipated? And we're going to dive a lot more into that in our future episodes, but just know that there's not one way except for the way that it happened for you.
What we do know, to be very clear though, is that when this initial response to loss occurs and you're processing through that, whatever way you deal with, emote, don't emote, numb, you're in a state of confusion, sometimes fear or even relief. And yet the one thing again is that things don't look the same as they did before. So that is what we know from listening to people's stories. That is the one thing that's very clear and evident in our model, is that once this initial response to loss has occurred, things do not look the way they once did.
Which that really leads us to our next space, which is a space of being lost. And it can really feel like a space of being adrift. And for me, I like to think of it as that the path forward is not clear, where in the uncharted territory, the path was clear. I could tell where I was going, and now the road is gone. There are barriers and bushes and fog or whatever kind of things that it can feel like for a person to be like, I don't know which way to go. and a sense of disillusionment about who am I now? What does this mean about the world and about how I'm going to continue to be in this world? Um, and if we think about not just death again, but about different types of losses, what does it mean now that I am a divorcee, now that I'm a widow, now that I'm a person with cancer? Like, I think part of this lost space is figuring out, who am I now?
I think it's also really important to note that there's really no time limit to how long someone can belong in any space. And the spaces can ebb and flow, or rather, you can ebb and flow throughout the spaces. And so you might see people that spend an awful lot of time in this lost space, right? So I might question, what does it mean for me to identify as a widow? Maybe I'm trying to hide parts of self when I don't feel like I'm in spaces with people that I can trust yet. And so my story feels different depending on what space I'm in. Yet when I'm feeling safe and brave, I might really be able to own some of those pieces without feeling like I'm shedding layers of self that I'm not yet ready to and comfortable with. Right. And so it's really important for us to consider those pieces. So again, how integrated was the identity that I lost, right? How integrated was that into who I am? What developmental stage am I at? And then what are these experiences with loss? So previous experiences in terms of, what do I know about the way I deal with loss, right? How do I know how to talk about it? Where did I learn how to express emotion tied to loss? Was I taught to keep it inside? And I think sometimes this is where American culture really comes into play, because we tend to really lean into the bravery that people experience when they hold it together versus allowing people to emote. So part of this model too is a way to acknowledge and destigmatize the grief response to loss and really normalize that emoting and processing through looks very different. And yet there is not one way to do that that looks brave. It's really about what rings true to who we are and how do we unpack that with all of the things that have been impacting us throughout the lifespan. So where previous models of loss really talked about reaching a certain task and then moving forward, or being in a certain stage and then moving forward, we're trying to figure out a way to hold space for the reintegration of self along the way.
And part of this, I think, and that process is that we can't hurry this. Like, there's no shortcut. Like, if you really think about what it's like to be lost, if you're lost in the woods, you can't just like aim one direction and just bushwhack out of there. You have to like carefully navigate and find your way and figure out, where am I going? Like, where's the way that I can actually take the next step? And sometimes we have to go around in circles, and we get like, I think another part of this for me is confusion. Like, because if we are like, who am I now? And I'm trying to make sense of the loss of relationship, or what I wish I would have said to the person I lost, or why did I lose this job, or why did this happen to me? Thinking about, we've talked to people that have experienced miscarriages and think there's got to be an explanation. So the mind just is trying to work through all of this confusion, and we look to many, many places to try to figure that out. And there's no shortcut. There's no direct like path out of here. So I think it's really important to honor that this is a valid space in the grief process, that we can't just skip to integration. We can't just say like emote, cry one time and go on. That this takes energy, it takes honoring, it takes validation. And part of that cultural piece is that if we don't know that, and if we don't recognize that in ourselves or others, then we can feel like there's something wrong with us, or we feel like we should be over it by now. And the shoulds and the expectations of hurrying, I think, just end up causing more problems and making it harder to integrate.
You bring up so many good points. One really being, we have to be considerate of cultural norms, cultural expectations, but then also simultaneously here in the States, really unpacking what it is that society says is normal. Pardon me. So being considerate of those cultural norms sometimes means, when Greek families wear black if they're connected to the person that died. But again, a lot of these historical components are death-related losses and not necessarily all loss, so non-death related loss. And so what does cultural norms, what are the rituals and the traditions speak to? We need to be understanding of that. We need to be in the know, if you will, to understand where our clients are coming to us from and what context. And then also helping to normalize the ways in which people react to various losses, right? Sometimes people will come and say, what's wrong with me? I just lost my grandparent, but I'm not really that sad. And I think that takes a lot of bravery to say something like that to one of us as a counselor sitting on the other side and honoring that space, but also recognizing that sometimes those losses that are expected, they've lived a full life. There's a story that comes along with it. And yet that story might impact somebody else completely differently. Just because somebody lived a full life or a beautiful life doesn't mean that everyone's going to react the same way. So that leads back to those layers of complexity, right? And trying to really look at how did one live holistically? Did they reach those stages in the developmental tasks of being generative and giving back? And how do they look at life in the end, or losses along the way? And how did that impact me?
And I think that's the other thing is like, we can't hurry ourselves along that path in the same way. And it also makes me think about how others try to fix us or make it better by
Or
saying,
brush past it.
by saying those kind of things. Well, at least they lived a long life.
Mhm.
It's not for anybody else to tell the griever to tell that story. Maybe that's how you feel, and that's your story for yourself, and that's how you are understanding and integrating. And that's perfectly fine. And if that's not where you are, it's never helpful for somebody else to try to reframe that for them.
I think there's really a part of the stage that's working towards taking ownership for their own experience versus, or maybe not versus, but while unpacking all of the outside messages that are coming in. What resonates with us internally and what doesn't? What do we want to hold on to and what do we need to shed so that we're not living in spaces of shame and guilt and regret? Because those three things can really infiltrate the system and break it down to a point where we're not able to figure out our way out of the lost space. When we sit in spaces of regret and shame and guilt and doubt in terms of what we did and how we dealt with things, we get stuck.
Yeah. And I can speak for myself that in this space, I was feeling like, why am I still crying? Why am I not over this? Why? And I just was like really hard on myself for a long time. And it wasn't till my counselor gave me permission to recognize like, this is part of the process. And that's when it felt like for me, it felt like a wall I was trying to push through, like before loss and after, and I just kept bumping up against it. And as soon as he gave me permission just to be, it became like an expansive space that I was like, oh, this is a territory to navigate. And I am just supposed to be here, and I won't always be here, but this is part of it. And so I had like honoring it and respecting it helped me get out of it, because otherwise before I felt like I was kind of knocking my head against the wall.
And I think one of the things you just said that's really key to the transcending part of our model is having trust in that, yes, this is happening now. Maybe I thought I should have been over it by now or through it by now, but the realization of this is just a space for me to be in, and I'm not always going to be here. That's really key to the transcending piece.
Yeah. I think that leads really well to our last space, which is transcending. And we've talked about that as the space where it's about integration. And for me, I think of this as beyond surviving. So in the space before, when the lost space, many people are still able to function and survive. Like they're able to go to the work, they're able to feed their kids, they're pushed through, they go to the celebrations or weddings to some level. It may not be at the level they were prior to the loss, but they're able to
maintain the day-to-day function.
Yeah, and compartmentalize a bit, like put it to the side. So, but it can't be ignored forever. Like the loss does need to be processed somehow. And it's not about acceptance. Like a lot of times you will hear this idea of acceptance and grief and loss. And to us, we don't like that word because it's kind of like I'm just supposed to like swallow it and just take it in and like it, and it's not about that, but it is more about that it needs to be processed and become part of who we are. And as we move forward and start functioning at a better level.
Yeah, so more or less, it's a process of really integrating grief in a way that's unique to you and allows for this integration to occur one moment at a time. And sometimes that means, this space can kind of ebb and flow in terms of what that looks like, right? So we're not ignoring the loss, and yet acceptance felt icky to us because it was like, I've accepted the reality and now I'm moving on, like check that box. And that's not what we wanted to go for. And we don't feel like that really resonates with the human experience of grief and loss either. So here we want to make sure that we're talking a lot about transcending as being the ing, right? Of it being a process that's ongoing. And so what we really noticed here among the people that we've talked with is that there's a wanting to give back to others. There's a wanting of passing along the story and sharing lessons learned so that people can see the way in which I see the world, right? So what lens am I seeing the world from? What lens are you seeing the world from? There's this new way then that we're kind of co-creating together. And such as like the world is not something to be controlled. It's not that we're promised anything tomorrow, but it means that we can kind of lean into our lived experiences and live life to the fullest with all of the things that come our way.
And I really see that as like it becomes a reframing. It's like before it felt like things were unfair and I was out of control. And now I'm like coming to terms with, I see the world differently now. I've learned a new lesson. I see that a lot, like, as far as like when I said in the law space, who am I now as a divorcee? Who am I now as a person who lost a job? Like at some point you do start to make sense of it and you say, like, not that it's okay and I like it, but that I have learned lessons from it and I can identify those lessons and I like myself and I see myself, and despite that things didn't go the way I wanted it to, and I'm never going to say that it's fair or that I would have chose those things, but that I feel like it just becomes a part of who I am, and I've learned something about life that is important.
Where the undercurrent is truly about trusting the process then, right? So there's a level of unawareness or a choice that they needed in order to trust that even though they were in a dark place, they can really know now that there is a way out, there is light along the way. And maybe sometimes it's only a shimmer or a glimpse, but yet there's going to be a way for them to also experience simultaneously those moments of joy and love and hope for the future, right? And so that's getting out of that lost space, transcending, and again, ebbing and flowing between those when you consider developmental context, when you consider anniversaries and other things that were really important to you, or a song or a memory. This is the integration of the holistic part of the model, where things like a song can bring you back in time and you can honor that space, the lostness that you experienced. And you can also then kind of put it back up on a shelf and say, I'm good, I've honored it, and I'm going to hold it with me. I'm also going to keep moving. So it's that trusting of the process. Am I willing to face the hardest parts and take that step forward? Because now I can see a path.
The idea of the opposite of that would be, I'm going to put it in a box and keep it there forever, and it's too hard to look at. I'm going to be overwhelmed with pain. So we talked about the both and earlier, like it's both, like the pain is there, I'm honoring it. I can look at it, I can say, oh, ouch, this still hurts today.
So many years later, right?
Yeah. And it's not that we're ever over it. And that's why it's not like something it's never important, but that we've integrated it to become And I like get this idea of like there will be scars, but we build the muscle over the scars and it becomes part of who we are moving forward. And I'm willing to look at it, and there's a willingness to lean in and engage with the hard parts. And that I think looks different for everyone else. Like, what is the leaning in? What is the processing? What is the lesson to be learned? That's the unique journey that we're all on.
Mhm. It's really truly getting to know your story, right? What speaks to you, what resonates to you, what makes you who you are. And all of these losses along the way have built you into the being that you are today. And it really humanizes the process of who we are and where we want to go. And so we feel like it's really important to really highlight some of the goals of this model when we're working from a strengths-based perspective, incorporating wellness and developments along the way. We're working to normalize human experiences, as grief is an ongoing process. Loss will occur along the way, and we really need to normalize that for people. We're hoping to help people recognize, right, that we need to see the loss, we need to see the grief, name it, and move through it. And sometimes that means some days look a lot darker than others, but yet there's always that both and, where I'm sitting in it and eventually I'm going to start to see that light, right? Again, just a glimmer or a shimmer of hope at some point. And so that's what we're kind of watching for and navigating for, the recognition of that hope. And then the individualization. So normalize, recognize, and individualize. And the individualization is not prescribing a specific method towards healing or towards acceptance, if you will, that other models have had, but it's really about trusting your own process in your own self so that you can arrive at a place where you're constantly recognizing who you are from a day-to-day perspective versus who you are as an end point.
Mhm. And so I really, in our next episodes that will be coming up, we're going to dive into each of these spaces a little more, and we're going to hear stories about how people like process this loss, the lessons they learned, so that we can do this, like normalize and recognize and find out their individual processes. And I think that as we move forward, hearing those stories, diving into what, in order to help recognize what your own unique process may look like for you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you back as we continue to learn through people's stories on Griefly Speaking.